Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with a video released by Vice President Vance, who apparently thought it was exculpatory, taken by the ICE murderer who filmed his victim, Renee Good, a 37-year-old mother of three, whose last words to him were, quote, "I'm not mad at you," before she was shot 3 times in the face, after which the ICE shooter is heard cursing, "effing bitch." Joining us to discuss the wider war on so-called woke women by Trump, Vance, Hegseth, and MAGA is Karen Greenberg, a noted expert and author on national security. She is a Future Security Fellow at New America, a Senior Research Fellow at New York University's Law School's Reese Center on Law and Security, and the co-host of the Spy Talk podcast. Her books include Subtle Tools, The Dismantling of American Democracy from the War on Terror to Donald Trump, and she has an article at The Nation, Trump's War on Women Somehow Got Worse. Then, with Israel on alert, expecting a U.S. strike on Iran, we'll examine whether the latest eruption of protest against Iran's corrupt and cruel clerical government will result in regime change, and speak with Mohsen Milani, the Executive Director of the World Center for Strategic and Diplomatic Studies and Professor of Politics at the University of South Florida. Professor Milani has served as a fellow at Harvard, Oxford, and Foscari University in Italy, and is the author of The Making of Iran's Islamic Revolution. And his latest book is Iran's Rise and Rivalry with the United States in the Middle East. Then finally, we'll assess why Trump is effortlessly destroying America as a new Cold War emerges, and speak with Alfred McCoy, who holds the Harrington Chair in History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and is the author of 24 books, including The Politics of Heroin, In the Shadows of the American Century, and To Govern the Globe. His latest book, just out, is Cold War on 5 Continents, A Global History of Empire and Espionage. And before we begin at the start of this new year, which will culminate in the fateful midterm elections in November, polls already indicate MAGA Republicans will lose the House and possibly the Senate. But we're up against a Trump-Miller presidency already drunk with power, and they will do anything to stay in power, having already demonstrated their contempt for the United States Constitution with Trump's January 6, 2001 coup attempt. They see over half of the country as their enemy and have a private army of loyal thugs ready to round up critics of the regime they label as communist lunatics. As Trump cowers, the media and his cronies buy up the mainstream press, Background Briefing will continue to expose this malevolent regime's fascistic machinations, providing a daily insight into the news as a massive coalition of people power is mobilized to bring about an end to this nightmare and usher in a new era of reform not seen since Nixon departed the presidency in disgrace. To help save America's 250-year-old democracy, we need all hands on deck, and you can make a tax-deductible donation to help us do our part at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org. And thank you. And joining us now is Karen Greenberg, a noted expert and author on national security, and she has an article at The Nation, Trump's War on Women Somehow Got Worse. Welcome to Background Briefing, Karen Greenberg.
Thank you for having me. It's nice to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us, Karen. And it would seem, given the reaction from the administration to the murder of the 37-year-old mother of three, Renee Good, in Minnesota, it's been overheated and quite cruel in a way from both Vance, Trump himself, and Kristi Noem. But it seems to me there's a wider context here on this MAGA war on so-called woke women, because you've got the incident that Corey Lewandowski, who really runs DHS, his girlfriend is the Ice Princess, is the kind of front in the federal building here in Los Angeles, which you can't get into unless you go through metal detectors. A U.S. senator was tackled and roughed up by Corey Lewandowski's thugs. And that, to me, set the tone that these people consider themselves both above the law and can act lawlessly. and they are defending the outrageous behavior of this ICE officer. And the victim, of course, is being blamed by Vance, who says she's a part of some vast left-wing network, by Noam, who says she's a domestic terrorist, and by Trump, who calls her, radical left lunatic. So isn't there something broader than just this incident, in the sense that there's this hatred or fear of women? I don't know how you want to put it. Your subtitle to your article at The Nation is "The Commander-in-Chief and his allies have deemed women the enemy." Elaborate on that, if you will.
Sure. Let me start just by commenting on how you teed this up, because I think it's important. I think there are two things that are going on here at the same time, and they're coalescing. One is a disregard for the law, whether it's domestic law, international law, whatever kind of military law. The idea is that the president and those he deems to be acting in his name on his behalf are not subject to the laws the way the rest of us are. And then you have the topic of women being the targets of so many things. And I just want to say, it's not just woke women, it's women. And it may be done in many cases in the name of woke, but it's not just woke women. And it's just this idea that women don't have what it takes to do what needs to be done. And just, to give you a recent example, Tulsi Gabbard being kept out of all the meetings or if I don't know if it's all the meetings, but being kept out of the decision-making meetings, it's been reported, that had to do with the attacks on Venezuelan boats, and on, including the examples that you cited. So I think this is an extraordinarily important moment to note in terms of what's happening to women. It began with the eradication of women in top posts throughout the government, whether it was the Federal Trade Commission, the National Labor Relations Board, or the military entities such as the U.S. Naval Academy, the Commandant of the Coast Guard was let go, and many, many others. And yes, many Black women were in top positions, were removed as part of this purge of officials from government who were women. Again, part of DEI, but whether or not these women were woke in their policies, etc., is not really the case. They were not necessarily progressive. They were women. And so we've kind of seen how this has been, it's just been gaining strength. And one of the things that happened, and one of the reasons I call it a war on women, is that Pete Hegseth has had a pretty strong role in this. He's questioned women's ability to serve in the military because they are not people who are going to take up the mantle of fighting. And he's gone on record and said that, and he's purged a number of things within the Pentagon. And I think that, purged women from a number of posts within the Pentagon. As you know, the military sites have taken down references to women, both historically. Arlington Cemetery has removed women from its database, including Jackie Kennedy Onassis. I mean, it goes on and on and on. I could have written a 20 times longer article. I just, wanted to make the point. And I do think it's interesting that so much of this has been happening elsewhere, but also in the Pentagon in this sort of like attack mode. And then there's the issue, let me just add one more thing. One issue I really focus on is the attack on women's bodies, which I also see as kind of within the military realm, and the dismantling of reproductive health agencies, offices, and services across the country is just unbelievably striking.
So you're referring to Trump, referring to a journalist who he said to her, "quite piggy." That's an example, right?
Of which thing?
Of that's an example of Trump's derision of women's bodies.
Oh yeah, that's an example. But then the policies themselves are an attack on women's bodies. Yes, quiet piggy is really. I mean, are you kidding me? But he called Kamala Harris retarded. He called Nancy Pelosi crazy as a bed bug. I mean, I don't know what these are attacks on, but it's,
Right.
Whether it's their body, their minds, or their souls, but it's attacks.
But isn't there, again, a broader context here in terms of misogyny and hatred of women, or fear of women, or however you want to put it? You've even got Trump's youngest son, Barron Trump, apparently is fascinated and communicates with the Tate brothers, these horrible sex trafficking brothers. who they were supposed to be arrested when they were deported from Romania to Florida, but the Trump administration intervened and stopped the arrest, and presumably Barron Trump played a role in that. You've got this young Nazi, Nick Fuentes, who Trump had a couple of years ago as a guest for Thanksgiving with Kanye West. I mean, he's an incel. And then you've got Joe Rogan's misogyny, and then you've got Charlie Kirk's misogyny. So isn't there a pattern here?
Yes, and it's, just as I hear you lay it out, and yes, there is. This is a longstanding pattern. You're right. It's not just about keeping women out of power. It's about a tremendous disrespect for women as other than objects. And it gets confusing because there's been so much lack of attention to professional qualifications in so many of the appointments that they've made, that it looks like, that women that are unqualified put in post to seem to expose their vulnerabilities, their weaknesses, their lack of expertise. But, it's all part of the same thing. And yes, there's a tremendous amount of misogyny, except for a certain kind of women. And they sort of fall into that category of the trad women that we've seen so much of lately.
And Attorney General Pam Bondi, of course, who voted against the Violence Against Women Act.
Yeah.
There's no shortage of those kind of women in the Trump administration. But back to the insults to this woman who was killed in Minnesota. I mean, the hatred that's pouring out. An example is the Daily Wire host Matt Walsh says, quote, "This lesbian agitator gave her life to protect 68 IQ Somali scammers who couldn't give less of a bleep about her." I mean, why this poison? Why? I mean, I guess...
Because it comes from the top. Why this poison? Because it's sanctioned at the very top. We're living in a country where hatred is being embraced out of the White House and throughout the administration. And of course on social media, it's given free rein, as if there's no allegiance to either the truth or the facts, but just to whatever the passion of the moment is. And it's expressed in violent ways. And you can look at the video, the one we've seen, right? And it's really hard to understand how you would call this woman a terrorist. She was not screaming and yelling. She was not expressing any kind of hatred or anger in a way that was out of control. He stepped in front of her car. I mean, it was almost like they were looking for somebody to shoot. I mean, they were, trigger happy would be another way of saying it. And again, we keep hearing about, there's going to be an investigation. Well, what's the investigation into? Is it into her, or is it into the guy who shot her? And we still don't know, what form it's going to take or even where it's going to happen. So it's really confusing and very demoralizing.
Right, but he shot her 3 times in the face.
3 times, yep.
And then he said, "effing bitch." I mean...
Yeah, no.
And why did J.D. Vance think he was released that video? Why did he think it was exculpatory?
It's a very good question. Why I think he thought that he could smooth talk it into, if he said it was exculpatory, people would believe it was exculpatory. And it's very hard to watch that video and understand how he thought that the interaction between them, that the violent activity was not on the part of the officer themselves. And a lot of people have brought up the issue of training, and the lack of training by ICE agents and the lack of appropriate training for understanding the use of force. But whatever it was, it's hard to find this as an exculpatory moment. And it really does make you question what is the essence of the training they're having in terms of use of force.
But when he talks about this vast left-wing network, there's no question that Renee Good and her partner were a part of... There's been a process going on in Minnesota, for example, and probably in other cities as well, where law firms and law schools, in this case Hamline School in Minneapolis, they've trained what they call legal observers.
Right.
To monitor what ICE is doing. And these 2 women were a part of that operation. But there's no central organization. It's not like George Soros is paying these women to do what they're doing. and that there's any real, nationwide organization. This is purely spontaneous and organic, coming from local communities.
Absolutely. And, today there's a bunch of protests taking place across the country in little towns, smaller protests. Everybody's looking for a way to say, no, this can't be us. This can't be what it means to live in the democracy we thought we lived in. And if you take something that's that as what we've seen on the video, as what appeared to be as little violently confrontational as it looked, if you take that and you punish that person by shooting them through the head, then it sends a signal, which is don't even breathe in the wrong way near us, because we don't have any rules binding us. We're going to do what we want to do. We're allowed to do what we want. And so it's extremely frightening. Added to that, what we're focusing on in this conversation was that it was to a woman, a mother, a wife. I mean, and it's really terrifying to watch, because the only message is you don't belong on the streets. You don't have the right of free speech. You need to go home. And the ramifications of this are quite vast. And I think that's why you're getting all these protests. It's sort of like a reliving in some ways of the George Floyd moment as well, because it has captured national attention.
Well, as I mentioned earlier on in this conversation, Karen, the fact that ICE and Lewandowski and the ICE princess have already shown that they can rough up a United States senator, right, indicates their arrogance and their sense of impunity. And then you've got Tom Homan, the border czar, getting $50,000 of cash in a bag, and Bondi and nobody wants to go after him. They think that's perfectly okay behavior. And he's got his proteges running the two biggest detention centers, Core Civic and Geo Group. God knows how much money is trickling down. You've got 105 billion that they've thrown at ICE. Then you've got Tricia McLaughlin, the woman that keeps making these outrageous apologies for the shootings and brutal behavior of ICE. Her husband runs the DHS's publicity through a PR firm that he owns, that he's a part of. I mean, all kinds of money sloshing around here. That's where I think there should be some focus. Do you have any sense that American journalists are onto this story about how much of the 105 billion is trickling down into the pockets of these ICE warriors and their protectors and people running DHS?
Yeah, we don't know. And I don't know whether they're looking into it or not, but what we do know is the point you brought up at the very beginning of that, what you just said, which is that we have the amount of money that was given to DHS for ICE and Customs and Border Patrol is immense. And so they're hiring at unprecedented rates, hiring thousands and thousands of people to join up. So they're building up their core of people who are, outside of traditional law enforcement. We don't know what their training is. It's different perhaps than DOJ, FBI, and here we are with all of this money being spent wherever else it's going, being spent on the ability to hire these individuals and send them places. And they're, as you saw, sending many more officers to Minneapolis right now, when state and local authorities are saying, we don't need these extra officers. We can handle this. And so, yeah.
Right, but just in closing, when the Supreme Court struck down or told Trump that he couldn't deploy the military in Chicago and other Democratic cities, he said, we're going to come back and we've got a workaround. Well, the workaround is clearly ICE, and they're going to be deployed in Democratic cities and across the country in November or prior to November in the elections. And if they can, they've already shown how brutal they are and how they can intimidate you. Isn't that ultimately what the game plan is?
It seems to be that, and I just want to say, you say the game plan. There is a game plan, and you've sort of made that clear in all of your comments today. And there's a plan. This is not unthought out. This is not just happening willy-nilly. They wake up in the morning, decide what to do. They have a plan, and yes, that's what we're seeing.
Well, Karen Greenberg, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Karen Greenberg, who's a noted expert and author on national security. She is a future security fellow at New America, a senior research fellow at New York University's Law School's Reese Center on Law and Security, and the co-host of the Spy Talk podcast. And her books include Subtle Tools, The Dismantling of American Democracy, From the War on Terror to Donald Trump. And she has an article at The Nation, Trump's War on Women Somehow Got Worse. We're going to take a brief station break and back looking at how Israel's on alert, expecting a U.S. strike on Iran. And we'll examine whether this latest eruption of protest against Iran's corrupt and cruel clerical government will result in regime change.
Why don't you take it and break it and tear it all apart? All I do is give, and all you do is take. Baby, why don't you give me a brand new start? So let me live. So let me live. Let me live. Leave me alone. Let me live. Oh, baby, and make a brand new start.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Mohsen Milani, who is Executive Director of the World Center for Strategic and Diplomatic Studies and a Professor of Politics at the University of South Florida. Professor Milani has served as a fellow at Harvard, Oxford, and Foscari in the University in Italy, and is the author of The Making of Iran's Islamic Revolution. And his latest book is Iran's Rise and Rivalry with the U.S. in the Middle East. Welcome to Background Briefing, Mohsen Milani.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to have a conversation with you about Iran.
Well, thanks for joining us. And it's beginning to look as if this latest insurrection against the clerical government of Iran, which is deeply unpopular, may actually be, I don't know whether you can say successful, but it certainly surpassed the 2022 Women, Life and Freedom movement's demonstrations. And you've got the bazaris from the Tehran Bazaar, the merchants joining in. And it does seem that what you were hearing from the Supreme Leader is somewhat irrelevant. He's basically saying that the protesters are ruining their own streets in order to please the President of the United States. Is there an element, though, to that, in as much as if Trump is encouraging people to demonstrate at the same time, saying he'll come to their rescue if they get killed? Well, they are getting killed, and he hasn't come to their rescue. So is Trump going to hang these people out to dry? Or, if you start bombing the government, it's likely to make them rally around the flag and have the opposite effect, isn't it?
Yes, you have raised a lot of good questions. Let me try to put this movement, what has happened in the past 2 weeks, in a broader context. First of all, I have to tell you there is a great deal of misinformation and disinformation about what is taking place in Iran, both by people outside of Iran as well as by the Iranian government itself. So we have to be very careful about some of the analyses and information we have received about Iran. The key question is, are we witnessing a repetition of past protests and riots? Or are we really beginning to see the emergence of something really new? My answer to this question is yes and no. No, because we have seen even much larger demonstrations before, most notably in 2009, when at least 1 to 2 million people took to the streets of Tehran against a contested presidential election. And we have seen other movements, such as the very successful, I think, women's movement against mandatory hijab. And we are also quite familiar with the way the state represses dissent. So in that regard, there is nothing new here. But this time, something is different. And I think that something has to do with 4 factors. One factor is that whatever the Islamic Republic says, or whatever any other person says about this, people are sick and tired of the economic freefall. They are sick and tired of inflation, sick and tired of their declining living standard. It is absolutely unbelievable. So people are tired and they really want to change things. So that's number one. Number two, for the first time, at least in the past 4 or 5 years, what is taking place in Iran now has a so-called leader. Now, Reza Pahlavi, the son of the late Shah, against whom the Islamic Revolution was launched, claims that he is the leader of this new movement. Now, it is too early to say whether he really does have popular support in Iran or not, but the fact that he has been able, at least in social media, emerge as the voice and face of this movement makes this very different than previous movements. The problem with him, I think, is one thing. He has been supported by Bibi Netanyahu of Israel, and he has been calling for U.S. military intervention in Iran. Now, anybody who is familiar with recent Iranian history, when you call for military intervention against your own country, you're going to have a lot of problems, and you're going to have problem of legitimacy. And the most important point, and the third point, and that's the key point, what is taking place in Iran is continuation of the 12-day war that happened in 2024. That is when the U.S., Israel, with the backing of the U.S., attacked Iran. And that war did not solve the problem. It ended up in a ceasefire. And the way the Islamic Republic is trying to frame this protest movement is as the second phase of that war. In other words, they're saying that the war itself, the use of military force, did not achieve America's and Israeli goals, and therefore now they are coming inside Iran and are supporting various armed groups. And the fact that Reza Pahlavi has publicly called for the military intervention has given a little bit of credence to what the Islamic Republic say. So, and finally, the last point. And these 2 points, the last 2 points are, I think, critical. This time it feels different because we have an American president named Donald Trump, who has shown that he can use force against the Islamic Republic. He has done it. He's the first American president who has ever attacked Iran directly. And that means that America is entering into a process which could lead either to regime change, to leadership change, or to a whole bunch of other possibilities. Therefore, we are really entering into an uncharted territory. And I am not, as an expert on Iran, as somebody who has been writing and reading about Iran for almost 4 decades, for me, it is very difficult to tell you what direction Iran is going to take. It has become too fluid. It has become too complex. But one thing I can tell you definitively, that the past 2 weeks has changed Iran and has changed the Islamic Republic. And the Islamic Republic can never go back to what it used to be.
Well, Mohsen, many years ago, I met the Shah's son, and he didn't strike me as being particularly sharp, but nevertheless, and I believe that Trump doesn't think particularly highly of him. But in terms of the people themselves, what the demonstrators are saying in the streets, saying not Gaza, not Lebanon, may my life be sacrificed for Iran. And I believe that's a widespread feeling amongst the people, that the country squandered its money and resources, and in doing so by its so-called axis of resistance. And they've achieved is they brought the United States and Europe and other powers to impose these crippling sanctions on them. So I'm wondering at what point, given the economic downturn, which is catastrophic, won't the members of the military and their families also be suffering And won't they be somewhat sympathetic to the people? I can't say that about the bsky because they're, religious fanatics. But is there a possibility that this economic distress is even hurting the people that would normally support this regime?
Absolutely. It has, and you're absolutely correct. And this is one of the reasons why I said we have entered into an uncharted territory. And that's why I started by telling you that this movement feels different than previous one, because Iran is really facing severe economic problems. And these problems cannot be solved until and unless either the Islamic Republic takes drastic reforms, which is likely to undermine the top leadership or a new oligarchy that has been developed in Iran, or they have to come to terms with some kind of agreement with the United States. Again, one of the reasons why I said America's involvement in this protest movement is key, because I am not very sure as of now whether the pressure President Trump is putting on the Islamic Republic, his public declaration that he is supporting the protesters, is because he really wants to change Iran, or is that a tactical maneuver in order to force Iran to come to the negotiating table? Because ultimately, for me, as an observer of American politics, I don't think President Trump is interested in getting involved in a long conflict with the Islamic Republic or with anybody in Iran. His main concerns are two things: Iran's nuclear program and Iranian missile program. And as he has shown so clearly in the case of Venezuela, when he got rid of Maduro, but now is collaborating and working with Rodriguez, that his main problem is not the regime itself, but the policies the regime pursues. In case of Venezuela, let the American oil company go back, get rid of, eliminate your relationship with Iran and Russia and China. And in the case of Iran, just come to the negotiating table, put an end to enrichment activities inside Iran, put a limit on your missile program, and everything else is fine. That's why I said, I don't know whether this movement can lead to regime change, but perhaps it could lead to change of leadership. Leadership change is very different than regime change. Leadership change is much more manageable because it happens from the top. The whole country doesn't disintegrate, and could end up in the result that President Trump is seeking. And of course, Israel is also seeking, putting an end to Iran's nuclear program and limiting its missile program.
Well, Iran's always had this dual government where you've got Pezeshkian, the president, and then you've got the supreme leader on top of that. And the supreme leader's son, Moshtaba, is also widely reviled. He owns a bank, which people are boycotting. It's a kind of clerical kleptocracy. Recently, Pezeshkian, the president, did warn about the economic distress and talked about corruption, which I guess is a barb at Moshtaba and the clerics. But now, of course, he's had to change his tune. So if your scenario is right, Mohsen, then you've already got half a government to work with, right? If the clerical overlay of the supreme leader somehow just goes away, and there's even reports in the British press that the supreme leader and his family who have massive amounts of money through their foundation, something like 60 billion, that they've been negotiating with Putin to go into exile. I don't know whether you can trust that. It's the Times of London I'm quoting from. But nevertheless, to the point I'm making about the dual government, you already have a government to work with, right, with Pezeshkian?
Yes, and yes, and again, you're right about corruption, and but I will say that about corruption. Part of it is because we have a government that does not represent the people, There is almost no accountability about what the supreme leader does, absolutely no accountability. And that by itself breeds corruption. But there is a second layer, second reason why this corruption has become so pervasive and is crippling Iranian economy. That is because of sanctions. American sanctions, European sanctions have been extremely effective, but the Iranians have found a way to bypass it, or at least in some ways try to bypass it. And the only way they could have done that is to do it in secret ways, in untransparent ways. And that has created incredible corruption and inefficiency in the Islamic Republic. Finally, one point that I want to make. There is one key element that we need to carefully watch, because that, to me, is one of the most important developments in Iran in the past 40 years. And that is actually past 46 or 7 years. For the first time, Iran has a military, both in terms of the IRGC or the Revolutionary Guards, as well as the regular army, as well as 16 or 17 competing intelligence agencies. It has a security infrastructure has developed in Iran. And that security military infrastructure or institution, and it is huge. It has been able to get itself involved in the Iranian economy, and it will play a major role in determining the future of the Islamic Republic of Iran and Iran. You have to pay more attention to that institution than to any one individual. And that's why I said there is a possibility of leadership change without regime change in Iran.
Well, Mohsen Milani, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking to you.
We're going to take a brief station break and back assessing why Trump is effortlessly destroying America as a new Cold War emerges.
اگه دیدی درد مردم و ولی چشاتو بستی ظلم به مظلوم رو دیدی و از کنارش رفتی اگه از ترس یا واسه منفعتت خوده کردی تو هم دست ظالم هستی تو هم مجرم هستی اگه خودتو به خواب زدی وقتی که خونا رو میریختن گرفتار کسبتی وقتی جون جوونا رو
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Alfred McCoy, who holds a Harrington Chair in History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and is the author of 24 books, including The Politics of Heroin, In the Shadows of the American Century, and To Govern the Globe. And his latest book, just out, is Cold War on Five Continents, A Global History of Empire and Espionage. And he has an article at Tom Dispatch, How Much Worse Will It Get by 2029? Welcome to Background Briefing, Alfred McCoy.
Ian, lovely to be back with you again.
Well, thanks for joining us. And Al, obviously I want to talk to you about your new book, but let's just touch on what you've just written about. How much worse will it get in 2029? How much worse will it get tomorrow? I mean, just the other day, Trump was interviewed by the New York Times, and he said the only thing restraining him is his own morality. Well, this is a thoroughly amoral and immoral man, so that's not particularly comforting. And you've recently written that what's enabling him is a compliant Congress, a complicit Supreme Court, and media corporations that are compromised. Do you see any restraints on him?
Yes, actually, three restraints. One, civil society, the courts, a lot of institutions, and of course the demonstrations by the American people, the No Kings Rally for a start, indicate that there is substantial domestic resistance that is serving to constrain Trump's actions. Furthermore, as a result of that overwhelming vote to release the Epstein files late last year, that vote put Trump and the American people on notice that Trump is a lame duck. And, the turning point, which is Charlie Kirk's organization, the deceased Charlie Kirk, and which is arguably the heart of MAGA, has effectively defied Trump's claims that he might run for a third term. Now, he's not about to do that. He can't do that. But what that was an attempt to do was to defy the reality that he's a lame duck president. And in defiance of Trump's wishes, Turning Point has already nominated their candidate for 2028, and it's not Donald Trump. It's J.D. Vance. So the MAGA coalition is breaking apart. There's rising resistance in the United States, and the reality is that Trump is a lame duck president. So domestically, he's being constrained in all kinds of ways by the courts and by civil society resistance, and that's why he's turning almost his entire attention to foreign affairs, because there he remains commander-in-chief, the head of the world's most powerful military, and he can act out his fantasies of empowerment. And that's why we're seeing this phenomenal series of foreign adventures by Donald Trump. And since he's acting in this extreme use of executive power, he's reviving a kind of faded empire, a classic 19th, early 20th century imperialism. At the broadest level, and this is something that I argue in my book, Cold War on Five Continents, if you look at Trump's actions, they are actually seemingly on the surface episodic, but they are in reality part of a coherent vision. And basically what Trump wants to do is set aside all of the bilateral and multilateral agreements that have secured this country's place in the world for basically the past 75 years. Things like the NATO alliance, the very important and little understood NORAD defense pact with Canada, the closest military alliance on the planet. Set those aside, and he has what I call a tricontinental vision, that there will be three great powers. Russia will be in ascent in the former Soviet sphere under the empowered leadership of Vladimir Putin. China under Xi Jinping will be dominant in East Asia, and the United States will have its sphere in the Americas broadly, but more specifically North America. And that's what lends coherence to these seemingly quixotic remarks that Canada's going to become the 51st state and he's going to retake the Panama Canal and he's going to grab Greenland. And that's Trump's tricontinental vision. And for a while it seemed episodic, and I hit upon the idea of it just by looking at his actions. But then last November, the administration issued its national security policy, and they make that very clear in there that the primary focus of U.S. national security, of U.S. diplomacy, is going to be the Americas, particularly North America. And I mean, frankly, and I can talk about that if you want, we're in what I call a new Cold War, and what others have called a new Cold War. And that strategy is tantamount to kind of unilateral surrender in this new Cold War. We can talk about that a bit if you want.
Well, this situation has led a lot of people to think that somehow Trump is working for Xi and Putin. But the historian Heather Cox Richardson suggested that what Trump is doing is the Putinization of U.S. foreign policy. So it's clear that Trump is jealous of the kind of unaccountable power that Xi and Putin and Erdogan and Orban and up until recently Maduro had, and that is you can enrich your family and your cronies, you can intimidate your political opponents and even disappear them, you can muzzle the press, and you can flood the streets of your country with armed thugs who'll do your bidding. That's what he's doing. But what's underlying it all, I think, or what gives it a different twist is that he's also basically extracting money and shaking people down. And so it's the politics of extortion. With Venezuela, for example, he's keeping the same people in, and now he's saying to the oil companies, he wants to basically have the Venezuelan government give over their oil revenues to him, and then he will in turn control that money and give it back to Delcy Rodriguez so that she can help the people of Venezuela so that they'll vote for her in upcoming elections, which will take place whenever Trump decides. So I think that's an example of it. I think also sanctions are a way to extort money because they don't make any other sense. They certainly don't make any economic sense. So is that a difference? In other words, this is a kleptocracy on a global scale.
Yeah, in the analysis of U.S. foreign policy, going way back, one has to balance two things: U.S. economic interests, and then the more strategic side of U.S. foreign policy. Sometimes they coincide, and that keeps the Marxists in the audience happy. And more often than not, they don't. There's a divergence. All right. So in the case of Trump, his grab for lucre for both the United States through policy and through himself and his family individually is almost comedic. It reminds me of the old Scrooge McDuck comics, the Disney comics with Uncle Donald Duck's Uncle Scrooge McDuck rampaging across the globe in a relentless search for profit in any small corner he could find it. Yes, that's part of Trump's policy. And if that's all it is, it's not of great consequence, lasting consequence for the world order. The world order can more than capably survive that. We survived the Russian oligarchs, so we can survive that as well. I think what's more serious and more substantial is the way that Trump is rupturing the fabric of the international legal order and the international security order that the United States built during the Cold War and largely maintained in the aftermath of the Cold War. And let me just describe it and talk about how Trump's policy is damaging. First of all, the Cold War. Many people have forgotten, but simply put, the Cold War was the largest, longest, and most consequential conflict in the history of humankind. There's nothing that can equal it, all right? It lasted 44 years. It ranged across the entire globe. It penetrated deep inside every society. The repressive apparatus in this society was so deep, so omnipresent, that most Americans have still not come to grips with how profound its penetration was. All right. Now, the way the United States fought the Cold War geostrategically was it recognized, and this is a very important realization, that the epicenter of world power has been for the past 1,000 years the Eurasian landmass, Europe and Asia combined into a 6,000-mile wide landmass, which then and now is the home to 70%, 7 out of every 10 people on the planet live on Eurasia. It's also the epicenter of world productivity. And if you're going to dominate the world, you have to control Eurasia. And the United States recognized that during the Cold War. And we did it by ringing Eurasia with a steel bands of alliances, starting with NATO, going all the way to CETO, and then 5 bilateral alliances with Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, and Australia. And that geopolitically contained the Sino-Soviet bloc, locked them up deep inside the continent of Eurasia. And then, as they began to realizing their geopolitical isolation, Moscow began trying to break out by backing revolutionary warfare everywhere from South Vietnam through the Middle East all the way to Central America. And the United States strategy was very simple, that when the Soviets sent arms, or in the case of Afghanistan, they sent 100,000 troops, we sent one person, a CIA operative empowered to conduct covert operations. And generally, those covert operations were successful in deflecting the Soviet bid to penetrate. The Soviets succeeded in Cuba, but elsewhere they did not succeed. Then the United States, with the Soviets contained behind the Iron Curtain, simply sat back and waited for the Soviets to make a great blunder, which they did in 1979 by intervening in Afghanistan. And by the time they left Afghanistan in 1988-89, the Red Army was so bloodied, so demoralized, even destroyed, that when Eastern Europe, the satellite states of the Soviet Union, erupted in mass civil society protests, the Soviet Red Army was unable or unwilling to move, and the satellites broke away, and the Soviet Union broke up, and the Cold War was over. And we maintained that strategy in the post-Cold War era. So the key component to that strategy really is this network of global alliances, NATO in Europe, NORAD with Canada here in North America, and then those bilateral security pacts, now 4 of them, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Australia. And Trump has been systematically demolishing that edifice of geopolitical power and withdrawing the United States from the epicenter of world power, Eurasia. You know, you think about all of his policies, you know, he's been a vocal critic of NATO. His attempt to take Greenland is creating a great crisis in the ranks of NATO. If he does make that move, the Europeans have said essentially that will destroy NATO. And that pushes the United States off the Eurasian landmass. Okay, and at this time of what's called a new Cold War, where the United States is leading a Western alliance, or has been until Trump, and still sort of is leading it, and then Moscow and Beijing are united, as they were back in the 1950s at the Cold War. Okay, in this great geopolitical struggle for the future of the world order and geopolitical power, Trump's retreat from Eurasia, his retreat from Europe, is tantamount to a unilateral surrender, ceding Eurasia to Moscow and Beijing, and it's just bizarre. You know, it is mystifying, but it is a reality.
Well, your article that I mentioned at Tom Dispatch, How Much Worse Will It Get in 2029, you bring up George Orwell. And Orwell actually wrote in 1984 an incredibly prescient description of the Cold War, to the extent to which he described it as 2 ruminant animals trying to gore each other but not really succeeding. But what they were really doing is basically shaking down their own peoples and waging war against their own people and taxing them for a military-industrial complex on both sides that couldn't deliver anything except the Soviets will die, and 20 minutes later we'll all die. So the extent to which we had a Cold War because you couldn't afford to have a hot war, the casualties, as you make clear in your new book, Cold War on 5 Continents, have been all the people around the world who suffered through these surrogate wars, right? And you just mentioned, you know, how the role of just sending one CIA guy in. Well, for example, in the case of Tibet, they sent in maybe 1 or 2 CIA people to get the tribesmen to harass the Red Chinese. And what did the Red Chinese do? They invaded the country and occupied it. So it was hardly a victory. And so many millions, as you point out, died as a result of these surrogate wars.
Yeah, the 2 aspects, the 2 dominant aspects of the Cold War were, of course, the string of strategic alliances from NATO through SEATO, and then the U.S. Security Pact with Japan and the other powers in the Asia Pacific. That was, if you will, the successful aspect of the Cold War, because it succeeded in containing the Sino-Soviet bloc. And although both sides, the Warsaw Pact on the Soviet side and NATO on the U.S. side, built up enormous nuclear arsenals, they were never used. All those strategic weapons were never deployed. So in that sense, the Cold War was successful. Moreover, in that long-term contest, which is basically a money-throwing contest, the Soviet Union ran out of money before we did, and they lost. Okay, so that part was relatively benign, although the costs were considerable, and largely successful. The other part of the Cold War was the relentless contestation in the covert realm. Look, once the Soviets got the bomb in 1949 and very quickly built up their own nuclear arsenal, the world realized, and Moscow and Washington realized, that they could never use those weapons. It was assured mutual destruction. So they were locked into a conflict. They couldn't use their main weapons. And so how could they compete? all of the tensions in that global competition shifted to the so-called Third World, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, remote from the epicenters of power. And it was a covert war contested in a realm that didn't necessarily set the alarm bells ringing and heading us up the escalation towards thermonuclear war. And these covert wars waged in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, sometimes with conventional forces, as in South Vietnam or Korea, but more often through surrogate forces, local forces being armed by both sides so they look like civil wars. Those led to about 20 million deaths worldwide during the Cold War. And that makes the Cold War probably the second bloodiest conflict in human history after World War II. Now, today in our new Cold War, the covert dimension is not nearly as prominent. Okay, back in the time of the old Cold War from 1947 to 1991, it was simultaneous with another process that most people have forgotten, decolonization. 40% of the Earth's surface was covered by colonies at the end of World War II, at the start of the Cold War in 1948. By the time the Cold War was over, all those colonies had become 100 new nations. And so there was a contestation for those colonies, which bloc they would join. And that's what was the driver of much of these particularly bloody covert wars. For example, Angola, that was a 25-year war as Angola was emerging from centuries of Portuguese colonial rule. Okay, well, we're beyond that now. So the covert dimension doesn't have that, kind of accelerant of decolonization anymore. So what we're really back to is the visible strategic level of the old Cold War is the dominant element in our new Cold War, which has been going on now for about a decade. And that's to say that it's really this classic triangulation of three great superpowers, Moscow, Beijing, and Washington, with their allies, their strategic forces, their economic power, their science and technology, constantly maneuvering for control of the planet. And it's in that circumstance which, the one thing that hasn't changed, Eurasia is still Eurasia. It's still the biggest continent on the planet. It's still home to 70% of the world's population and productivity, and it's still the epicenter of global conflict. Basically, to be a dominant world power, you have to dominate Eurasia. And Trump is almost unilaterally, by undercutting NATO, withdrawing us from that position and essentially ceding that continent to Moscow and Beijing, and thereby ceding control of the globe, its economy, its order, its legal systems, and all of that to Moscow and Beijing. It's just bizarre. It is just bizarre. Right. And we will all pay the consequence of it. The other thing that most Americans are starting to discover with Trump's tariffs is that we're no longer, we haven't been since the 1890s, an isolated economy. Okay, and we are now thoroughly immersed in a global economy. And so these changes in the international arena are going to impinge directly and forcefully on the quality of life here in the United States. And we can see it in a number of ways already. And if you want, we can talk about the relationship between the changes in the international arena and the way it's going to impinge upon the quality of life domestically in the United States.
Well, Al, we've run out of time. We'll do that again in another, because there's so much in your book that we need to talk about. And you left us thinking about whether or not Trump is a traitor or a fool, or both. And I thank you so much for joining us here today.
Ian, it's been lovely. Thank you for having me.
And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And I'll be back tomorrow with another background briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another background briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.
One more light goes out.